In 1863 it was mined, patrolled, and deadly. A Union gunboat slid forward with its lights masked. On deck stood Harriet Tubman, once hunted as property and now moving with the U.S. Army. She was not running away. She was returning into enemy territory on purpose. If the plan worked, families would surge to the boats. If it failed, the river would swallow them and the world might never know. Come with me into this journey. Before we begin, drop in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration right now. Harriet Tubman entered the world in bondage on Maryland's eastern shore in Dorchester County in the early 1820s. Most records place her birth around 1822, though enslaved births were rarely documented with precision. She was born Araminta Ross, the daughter of Ben Ross and Harriet Ritt Green, both enslaved. Her first landscape was marsh, pine, and narrow roads cut between plantations. Her first reality was a system built to own bodies, separate families, and turn human life into property that could be bought, mortgaged, or sold away. From childhood, she learned that slavery was not simply forced work. It was a discipline meant to control movement, information, and emotion. Enslaved people were watched, timed, threatened, and punished. They were also expected to perform obedience on demand, even when the demand was irrational. Inside that pressure, black families developed a different set of skills: silent communication, mutual aid, and an instinct for reading danger. Tubman's later reputation for courage would be built on that early training because survival required attention. She was hired out as a girl, sent away from her parents to labor for other households, a practice that increased vulnerability and isolation. Tubman later recalled hunger and harsh treatment. The point was not only to extract labor, it was to teach that comfort could be removed at will, that a child could be made to feel alone, and that resistance would be met with force. Yet even then she absorbed lessons that would matter later: how to endure long hours, how to watch people without being noticed, and how to keep her mind moving when her body felt trapped. Then came the injury that would follow her for the rest of her life. While still young, she was struck in the head by a heavy object thrown by an overseer during an attempted punishment of another enslaved person. The blow nearly killed her. Afterward, she lived with headaches, seizures, and sudden episodes of sleep. She also experienced vivid dreams and visions, which she interpreted through her faith. The injury did not make her mythical. It made her a woman living with chronic pain and unpredictability, forced to carry her body like a burden and a warning, and still expected to work. In the 1840s, she married John Tubman, a free black man, and she began using the name Harriet, likely honoring her mother. But marriage did not protect her. Under slavery, her status remained property, and any children she might have had would have inherited her enslaved status. Love could exist, but it could not rewrite the law. The danger Tubman feared most was not only the whip, it was the sale notice, the sudden separation, the way a person could be removed from everyone they knew and vanish down a road. By 1849, as the threat of sale pressed in, she fled. The details of her route are partly reconstructed from later recollections and from what is known about networks along Maryland and Delaware, but the central fact is solid: she escaped slavery and reached the North. She later described crossing into free territory as a moment of disorientation, as if the air itself changed, yet freedom arrived with unfinished grief. Her parents were still enslaved, her siblings and friends were still at risk. A life saved did not feel complete when so many others remained trapped. The United States soon made that partial freedom even more precarious. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 strengthened federal enforcement, empowered slave catchers to pursue alleged fugitives across state lines, and punished people who aided escape. For black communities in the North, it turned streets, train stations, and workplaces into places of surveillance. A person could be seized on a claim, denied fair hearing, and forced south. Tubman now faced a brutal paradox. She had escaped slavery, but the law could still reach for her body. So she did something that still sounds unreal. She went back, Over the 1850s, Tubman returned to the borderlands of slavery multiple times to guide people out. Because secrecy was essential, records are incomplete and exact totals are debated, but historians agree she became one of the most effective conductors in the Underground Railroad's informal system. She moved at night, relied on trusted contacts, and chose routes that minimized exposure. She guided relatives and strangers, and she helped bring her parents to safety in the North, a rescue that carried both love and immense risk. The popular image is a lone hero leading silent lines through moonlit woods. The reality was messier and more human. Each person she guided brought fear, exhaustion, and the risk of second thoughts. A child could cry, a foot could bleed, a grown person could freeze at the first bark of a dog. If someone turned back, the danger was not only to them, it could expose everyone. Tubman's job was to keep people moving, to keep their trust, and to make decisions in real time with no margin for error. She carried responsibility like weight in her hands. Her faith and the visions that followed her injury gave her resolve, but she never confused faith with luck. She also had to navigate a North that was not a sanctuary. Many white Northerners opposed slavery, yet opposed black equality. Anti-black violence and discrimination were facts of daily life. Tubman took low-paying work, often domestic labor, to fund her missions. She connected with abolitionist networks that included black community leaders and white allies. She became known among people committed to ending slavery, including Frederick Douglass. Their documented relationship reflects shared purpose and a shared understanding that freedom required both public pressure and private rescue. By 1861, the country erupted into civil war, and Tubman read the moment with the same clarity she used on midnight roads. Enslaved people were already reshaping the conflict by fleeing to Union lines, forcing federal authorities to confront the reality that slavery powered the Confederate economy and war effort. The Union did not begin the war with a universal promise of emancipation, but black people pushed the war in that direction by their own actions. Tubman's question became urgent. If the conflict opened a door, how could it be used to free as many people as possible? She traveled to the Union-held Sea Islands region of South Carolina, near Beaufort and Port Royal. That coastal foothold was a laboratory of freedom and a battle. Field of competing powers. Plantations lay nearby, still worked by enslaved labor under Confederate control. The rivers were highways through a landscape of rice fields, marsh, and dense vegetation. They were also lethal. Confederates placed torpedoes, what we would now call mines, in waterways, and patrols watched the banks. Tubman had spent years moving through danger with only her feet and her instincts. Here, danger was industrial. In South Carolina, Tubman worked as a nurse and aide among newly freed people living near Union lines. Camps were crowded and disease could spread fast. She also moved into a more secret role, scouting and intelligence gathering. Documentation is uneven, partly because intelligence work avoided detail and partly because black women's contributions were often minimized in official reports. Still, contemporary accounts indicate she gathered information from people who knew the terrain and the movements of Confederate forces, and she helped translate that knowledge into action that the Union could use. Here is the pivot that explains the title. Tubman did not simply appear on a gunboat by accident. She was valuable because she understood the most precious currency in a conflict like this: information. An army can have rifles and uniforms and still be blind. Tubman could help it see. She could translate a whispered warning into a navigable channel and an unmarked path into a route that spared lives. The question was whether the military would true to what black people on the ground already knew. The Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863, declaring freedom for enslaved people in areas still in rebellion. It did not free everyone everywhere, but it changed the war's declared purpose and expanded the recruitment of black soldiers. Along the South Carolina coast, it also sharpened Confederate fear. A raid could do more than burn supplies. It could remove labor, weaken plantations, and turn rivers into escape corridors. It could force enslaved people to make a choice under fire, and it could prove that black people were not merely the subject of history, but the engine of it. In early June 1863, that possibility became a plan. Union forces organized an expedition up the Combahee River. The operation is widely known as the Combahee River Raid. Colonel James Montgomery led it with Union gunboats and black troops from the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. Tubman's role, documented in accounts of the raid, involved scouting and guiding, helping Union forces navigate the river and identify targets while avoiding torpedoes. She was moving with military power, but she carried a different authority, credibility among people who had survived the plantations. In the dark, the boats advanced. Engines were kept low. Men stood ready with rifles. The river surface was black glass broken by the wake. This was not a moment for speeches. It was a moment for small sounds, the creak of wood, the scrape of a boot, the hiss of steam. The water could hide a mine. The shoreline could hide a rifle. Every bend could turn into a trap, and every mile upriver made retreat harder. Tubman's work here was not a dramatic charge. It was attention, memory, and nerve. When the raid struck, Union forces destroyed Confederate resources. Bridges were burned and supplies damaged, disrupting the plantation economy that fed the rebellion. But the heart of the raid was what it triggered among the enslaved. Word traveled fast along the banks. In slavery, news was precious and dangerous, passed through whispers, songs, and sudden glances. Now the message spread that Union boats were there and that the way out was open. The river, for once, might carry people away instead of carrying rice and wealth for someone else. People ran, not in neat lines, but in waves, through brush and mud, through tall grass, across narrow paths known to those who worked the fields. Some carried bundles, many carried nothing. Parents grabbed children by the hand. Elders moved as fast as their legs allowed. The sound of it is hard to imagine without turning it into a movie, but at its core it was plain. Human beings choosing to flee a place that claimed to own them. Confederate resistance and confusion made the escape dangerous, and the boats could not hold forever in exposed water. Reports from the time and later historical accounts state that more than 700 enslaved people were freed as a result of the raid, many reaching the boats or Union lines. Because chaotic escapes are hard to count precisely, the number is sometimes reported differently, but the scale is consistent. This was mass liberation. It was not one family slipping away, it was a section of riverbanks breaking open. For the people aboard those boats, freedom did not arrive as a courtroom ruling. It arrived as a deck under their feet, a shoreline falling behind, and the terrifying knowledge that the future was unknown but chosen. Tubman's presence mattered in a way that is easy to miss if you only look for formal command. A crowd of terrified people needs more than an open door. It needs direction, reassurance, and timing. Tubman had spent years guiding small groups through panic. She understood how fear can freeze a person in place and how a steady voice can unfreeze them. Accounts describe her helping coordinate and encourage the escaping people toward the boats, using her knowledge of the area and her credibility among black communities to keep the movement flowing when confusion could have turned fatal. The raid also exposed a larger truth about the war. Freedom was being produced not only by proclamations, but by black action, by the enslaved who ran, by black soldiers who fought, and by black intelligence networks that made operations possible. Tubman's role sits at the intersection of all three. She was a formerly enslaved woman helping execute a strike that freed hundreds. That fact challenges the way many Americans are taught to picture who makes history, and it raises an uncomfortable question. How often has black labor built victories that were later credited elsewhere? She did it while the nation questioned black humanity daily. Recognition lagged behind reality. Tubman's wartime service was real, but much of it was informal, and bureaucracies prefer paperwork over testimony. After the war, she struggled for years to receive compensation and a pension that reflected what she had done. The delay was not only personal hardship, it was a pattern in a country that could praise a legend while neglecting the living person, especially when that person was a black woman whose labor did not fit official categories. After 1865, Tubman's life did not soften into comfort. She settled in Auburn, New York, connected to abolitionist allies such as William H. Seward, and devoted herself to care, family members, people in need, and the wider black community. The post-war era brought legal abolition, but not safety. Reconstruction briefly opened political possibilities for black Americans, and then white backlash used violence and law to narrow them again. Tubman lived long enough to watch the nation retreat from promises made during war. Here is the midpoint reframe that makes her story heavier, not lighter. Tubman's most famous acts unfolded when the nation was forced to confront slavery's brutality, but the cost of her choices extended far beyond wartime, lifelong injury, economic insecurity, and the daily work of survival in a hostile society. Heroism did not exempt her from illness or racism. It meant she carried those burdens while still trying to lift others. She also entered public movements beyond abolition. In later decades, she appeared at gatherings connected to women's rights, aligning with suffrage advocates. Her presence carried a sharp reminder: freedom struggles overlap. A black woman who had fought slavery and served in war understood that citizenship without political voice was fragile. But the suffrage movement of the late 19th century was often divided by race, and Tubman's life shows how frequently black women were asked to contribute while being pushed to the margins of recognition. In her later years, she helped establish a home for aged and indigent African Americans connected to her church community. Eventually, she lived there herself as her health declined. She died in 1913 in New York. The country she left behind still carried segregation, racial violence, and deep inequality. The story does not end with a clean victory, because Tubman's life was never about neat endings. It was about relentless motion towards something better, even when better remained unfinished. Over time, Tubman became a symbol, and symbols are tempting to polish. Some retellings attach precise numbers to her rescues that cannot be fully verified. Some attribute exact quotes without documentation. The strongest way to honor her is not to inflate her into myth, but to tell the verified story with full weight. She was born enslaved, she escaped. She returned repeatedly to guide others out. She served the Union cause in the Civil War, including as a scout and guide in the Combahee River Raid that helped free hundreds. And she spent the rest of her life fighting the quieter battles that freedom demanded. Now return to that dawn on the river. Imagine the gunboat turning back down the Combahee with decks crowded, people breathing hard, clutching children, staring at the shoreline shrinking behind them. Relief would have been mixed with fear, because freedom was not yet secure. Union lines could mean safety, but also uncertainty, hunger, disease, displacement, and the hard work of building a life without property in a nation that had profited from captivity. Tubman understood that. The raid was a door, not a guarantee, and opening it was only the first step. That is why the title's contradiction matters. The Conductor returned into enemy territory, not because she loved danger, but because she understood what slavery tried to steal: the ability to choose. On that river, choice became collective. Hundreds chose to run, black soldiers chose to fight, and Tubman chose again to risk herself so that other people could have a future she might never fully enjoy. Her legacy is not only bravery, it is a method. Gather information, build trust, move with purpose, protect the vulnerable, accept the cost, then do it again. When Americans speak her name today, the comfortable version is to treat her as a completed hero in a completed past. The honest version is to hear her life as a question aimed at the present. If freedom has always required ordinary people to take extraordinary risks, what are we willing to risk now? And who is still waiting at the shoreline for someone to lead the way?